Trust is a very complex virtue. It's one of the most precious gifts you can offer someone, your trust. But what happens when that gift is broken? And worse yet, by the very person you feel the safest being around. Well, 17-year-old Bernadette Walker confided in someone very close to her about a horrendous occurrence. But instead of supporting her, this person betrayed her. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, because the very next day, on July 18th of 2020, Bernadette just vanished. The case of Bernadette Walker is not only frightening, but also makes you question who you can really trust, because Bernadette asked her close family for help, and they offered none, and instead, they turned their backs on her. Welcome to True Crime Stories. If you're new here, I'm your host, Ty Knotts. I post new true crime documentaries multiple times a week, so be sure to hit that subscribe button. It's totally free and keeps you up to date with all of my latest cases. There's no overblown drama, not too many crazy opinions, just true crime. Bernadette Walker was born on December 13th of 2002, and today's case takes place in Peterborough, Cambridgeshire in England. Bernadette's mother, Sarah Louise, at some point after Bernadette was born, decided to part ways with her biological father, but we don't really know anything about what happened between the two of them. Bernadette was known to her family and friends as B, and while she was a bit shy around new people within her circle, she was described as a fun-loving, bubbly, and all-around fun person to be with. B was fond of art, particularly photography. Her camera was with her everywhere she went. And this was why, after graduating high school, B enrolled in Peterborough College, where she was studying photography. B also had big dreams of moving out of her hometown of Peterborough and settling in the United States after school. Like any other teenager, she also loved social media. Because of her shy and introverted nature, she preferred to interact with her friends online. B also loved to knit, and this was something that she learned from her grandmother. The two shared a very close bond, and B was overall very close with her family. Every single person who knew B saw her as a gentle, kind, and expressive person who just wanted to chase her dreams. When B was just a toddler, her mom Sarah met a man named Scott Walker. Sarah and Scott were actually neighbors. She moved next door to him in 2006, with 5 kids while being heavily pregnant with her 6th child. That's a lot of kids, so you can imagine the chaos that must have been B's home life. Her mother, Sarah, was also raising all of these kids alone. See, after things didn't work out between Sarah and B's biological father, she bounced around from one relationship to another and never really found anyone that she was willing to settle down with. This led to Sarah's 6 children, each having different fathers. The thing is, Scott, Sarah's new neighbor, was married at the time that B, Sarah, and the kids moved in next door. Scott and his wife Jill actually met in August of 2004 when she was a single mother of 2 teenage boys. So they'd been together for about 2 years at this point. Initially, Jill thought that Scott was a very loving and thoughtful man, and the relationship moved fast. In less than 2 months, Scott moved in with Jill and her sons. But this was when Jill noticed a complete and alarming shift in Scott's personality. He became obsessive, controlling, and always wanted to know whether Jill was cheating on him with another man or not. According to Jill, this all came out of nowhere and was completely unexpected. Scott was very manipulative. Even though Jill claimed he never physically abused her, during a heated argument he made some very frightening threats, and let's be honest, sometimes a voice can be a lot more damaging than a fist. All of this made Jill feel very hopeless. She quickly became a victim of Scott's cruel abuse, but she couldn't fathom the thought of leaving him. In fact, they stayed together for 10 months, after which Scott asked Jill to marry him, which was as shocking to Jill as it probably was for you to hear. But sadly, because Jill was trapped and driven into a corner of abuse by Scott, she felt she had no choice but to say yes. Now, I don't know if Jill thought that maybe getting married might make things better, or if she truly was just being ruled by fear, but this was so heartbreaking to find out. The couple finally married in 2005, and things only worsened from that point on. Scott was very demanding and selfish, and his behavior was completely inexcusable. It became clear to Jill very early on in their marriage that Scott didn't have any respect for her whatsoever, only demands. This went on for some time until Scott set his sights on his new neighbor, Sarah Louise. Jill would constantly witness her husband flirting with Sarah. But Jill wasn't heartbroken or tormented over Scott's infidelity. Jill, as morbid as it may sound, wanted Sarah to have Scott so that she could free herself from the clutches of his abusive and emotionally manipulative personality. Seeing him buttering up Sarah, it brought her immense joy. Jill saw this as a way out, and she, with the help of a friend, packed her bags and left Scott, and even served him with a protective order that forbade him from being near her. Well, Scott didn't mind Jill's departure one bit, as he quickly dove headfirst into a whirlwind of a relationship with Sarah. Bea was still a toddler at this point, and she looked up to Scott and even called him Dad, which is so heartbreaking knowing what's going to happen later on. Even though Sarah and Scott weren't legally married, Sarah changed her and all of her children's last names to Walker. This makes it so clear just how serious Sarah was about this new relationship. Sarah and Scott also went on to have 4 children of their own. And if you're not great at math, that's 10 kids living under one roof in a house with only 5 bedrooms. It's safe to say that there were a lot of people and a lot of opinions in this home. Sarah worked in geriatrics, whereas Scott would jump from one odd job to another. Although one thing is for sure, Scott loved to brag on social media. He was always building himself up on social media, making himself to be something he's not. But things were far from perfect inside the Walker home. And in fact, they were toxic to the max. One of Bea's brothers, Anthony, came out and claimed that Scott was physically and verbally abusive to everyone in the family. Anthony also went on to say that Scott was unfaithful to Sarah and that he'd had multiple affairs with a variety of women. Anthony also disclosed another disturbing detail about Scott. He had set up cameras in every room of the house, including the family bathroom. Let that sink in for just a bit. There are 10 children in the house, and Scott has cameras in the bathroom. In Scott's defense, the cameras were allegedly for catching Bea red-handed, as she apparently hid candy wrappers in toilet paper rolls. But I can't help but think that things are about to get a lot worse. It was July of 2020, and things in the Walker household weren't getting any better. Scott was now 50 years old, Sarah was 37, having just given birth to a baby girl in June, and by now Bea was 17 years old. Sarah, finally fed up with Scott's manipulation and behavior, was also ready for some change. Scott and Sarah had now broken up, and Sarah was actually seeing another man named Chris O'Connell. But there was something very bizarre about this whole thing. Even though Scott and Sarah were no longer together, Scott still lived in the Walker home. In fact, Scott decided to turn things up a notch and set rules for Sarah while she was dating Chris. This man, I don't even have words. But according to Scott, Sarah was only allowed to stay over at Chris's house 2 days a week. Also, Chris was never allowed to stay over at the Walker house. Now that rule, I get that one. It's Scott's house too. At least I think. But to tell someone who isn't your wife, who isn't your partner, she's literally nothing but a roommate to you at this point, when she can and can't see her boyfriend, that's just beyond the realm of understanding. Well, fast forward to July 17th of 2020, at around 10 p.m. Scott drove Bea to his parents' house in Warrington. Bea was wearing all black clothes with a blue denim jacket and black thick-framed glasses. During the ride, Scott confiscated Bea's phone, but we don't know why he did this. And according to Scott's parents, Bea was visibly upset when she arrived at their home. Anyway, Bea went on to sleep at around 1 a.m. And on the morning of July 18th at about 10:25 a.m., Scott came to pick Bea up to take her back home. But Bea never made it home. According to Scott, he'd made a small stop to have a cigarette near Skater's Way when Bea flung open the car door and took off. Scott tried to follow her, but he couldn't catch up, and in the end, he just went back home. When Sarah saw Scott returning home, she noticed that he was exhausted and was on the verge of breaking into tears, but she didn't think much of it. Remember, she couldn't have cared less about him at this point. But what was alarming about all of this was that Sarah, Bea's own mother, didn't report her daughter missing until 3 days later, even though she noticed that she hadn't come home with Scott almost immediately. This is not normal behavior coming from a mother. When a child goes missing, the parents, especially mothers, report it to the police right away. What took Sarah so long in reporting her own daughter missing? And what happened during those 3 days? Well, a lot of things happened, and we're about to find out that Bea was truly helpless. No one was there for her, not even her own mother. In the years that have passed since this case unfolded, some pretty haunting details have emerged. B was very clearly suffering. Not only was she raised in a household with a violent father, but her mother was also all but absent from her life. We don't know if this was simply by choice or because she was trying to raise 10 children, but either way, it is inexcusable. B was suffering from the unimaginable, and infuriatingly, the main perpetrator was someone she called Dad. It turns out, behind Sarah's back, B was being taken advantage of by Scott in a nightmare that spanned nearly 7 years. But sadly, that wasn't all. B thought that she could turn to her other parent, her own mother, for security and comfort. But B was proven wrong again. When she came clean with her mother about what Scott had been doing to her mother didn't believe her. She called her own daughter a liar. Mind you, this is coming from a man who openly abused his family, openly was having an affair with multiple other women, and he was even openly abusive to his previous family. But you don't believe he has it in him to take advantage of a young girl? Now, I try my best to maintain composure when presenting these cases, but what a freaking moron. What a disgrace and a wholehearted waste of breath. When you become a parent, your whole world changes. Your whole job on this planet is to take care of your children. Always love them, always believe them, always protect them. But this disgusting excuse of a mother chose to do nothing. If all this wasn't bad enough, B's mother ended their conversation by telling B she would literally kill her if she ever told anyone else about this. It is so nauseating that Sarah would rather stand up for a narcissistic, abusive man whom she had plans of leaving anyway, instead of her own daughter. What a wasted parenthood. But things didn't end there. As soon as Sarah made the call to report her daughter missing, 3 days after B apparently ran away, the operator was asked some basic questions, whose answers were already very suspicious. Apparently, Sarah had received a text from B saying that she was staying with her ex-boyfriend, Luke, after she had run away. But the operator was baffled that Sarah or Scott hadn't gotten in contact with or even visited Luke in order to see B. The operator immediately knew something was fishy. Regardless, the detectives began searching for B in neighboring areas. Police conducted searches in Gunthorpe, Newborough, and other parts of Peterborough and Cambridgeshire. But sadly, there was no sign of B. Another thing that investigators did that eventually pulled the curtain off the ruse Scott and Sarah were pulling was checking their phones. And boy, did they find a lot of strange things. First, Scott's phone activity was very weird and all over the place on July 18th. See, he had turned his phone off after he picked up B from his parents' house, and this was at about 11:23 a.m. to 12:54 p.m. And cell phone activity also showed him, as well as Sarah, going to a specific place multiple times after B was reported missing. It was a lock-up garage owned by his parents in Walton. Alarmingly, Scott also made a stop there the day that he was supposed to take B back home from his parents' house. The detectives immediately went out to search this lock-up garage, and even though they didn't find B, they did find something of hers, a backpack. This backpack was immediately taken in as evidence, and what officers found inside gave them an idea of how much trouble B was in. See, B always kept a diary and wrote in it ever since she was young. But there was one journal entry that shocked the police, and it said, quote, "Told my mom about my dad and the abuse. She called me a liar and threatened to kill me if I told the police. What kind of parent wouldn't believe their daughter?" It's so heartbreaking to see B's sadness emanating from these words in her diary. She truly believed that Sarah would be on her side, but she was proven detrimentally wrong. But the detectives weren't done looking. They also decided to reach out to B's friends and ask about Scott's abuse, and most of them came forward with more details. According to one of B's friends, Warren Naylor, B had confided in him about Scott taking advantage of her. But Warren later pointed out that on July 19th, a day after B had apparently run away, he received a message from her on Instagram, which said that she had lied about the abuse. But remember, Scott had confiscated B's phone on the route to his parents' house. B didn't have access to her phone, so how could she text her friends or even her mom, Sarah, about staying over at Luke's? Well, this was another point where the case took an unbelievable turn. Investigators, after some digging, found out that the messages being sent to Sarah and B's friends were from B's phone, but she obviously wasn't the sender. It was actually Sarah, her own mother. It was speculated that Scott, after learning that B had told her mother about the disgusting actions he'd been taking part in, lost his temper and attacked B and ended her life on the way back to her home from his parents' house. Scott didn't want his dirty laundry to be aired out and get him kicked out of the home, so he decided to take B out of the picture. But that wasn't all. Remember that Scott's phone was turned off for quite some time? Well, it's alleged that Scott took B's life during this time, a period of about 91 minutes, and disposed of her body somewhere miles away from home. Afterwards, the first call that he made was to Sarah. Even though no one knows what was said in that call, it was 9 minutes long, and the police speculated that it was them discussing their plan to cover up B's murder. It's so heartless and unimaginable. But the thing is, Scott's actions were heinous no matter how you look at it. But what about Sarah? Didn't she feel even an ounce of guilt discussing a cover-up for her own daughter's murder over the phone with the very person who so viciously took her life? It's so chilling to think that Sarah went along with the whole plan of sending messages from B's phone to make it look like she was in contact with her friends and family, but in reality it was actually Scott and Sarah's own doing. This proves just how little B's own mother actually cared for her, which is nearly impossible to understand. With all of this evidence, along with statements from B's friends and brother Anthony about Scott's abuse and him recording everyone in the house, both Scott and Sarah were arrested on September 14th, 2020, on charges of murder and perverting the course of justice. The detectives were still looking for B's body, but sadly, they've been unsuccessful, and to this day, B has never been found. Something definitely happened to B. But if there wasn't a body, then how could a murder trial be successful? Well, the evidence against Scott and Sarah was just too damning, and coupled with the terrible abuse that B was enduring, there was a very clear motive for Scott. The trial mainly consisted of statements from B's friends about Scott taking advantage of her, even though Scott had the audacity to deny everything. When asked about the hidden cameras in the house and in the bathroom, Scott shockingly stood by his baseless stance of catching B in the act of hiding candy in the bathroom. But knowing what we know now, I think it's pretty clear to see why Scott put cameras in that bathroom. Another thing that the police came across was a Facebook post when B had changed her relationship status from single to in a relationship with Luke. Now, there was nothing wrong with the post itself, but there was a very weird comment left under it. This makes me want to throw up even repeating the words, but Scott left a comment under the relationship status saying, quote, "Any boy who kisses you better have the image of me in your head." He even included a black and white picture of himself attached to the comment. Even after this revelation, Scott continued to deny everything and still maintained that B simply ran away from the car on their way home. Sarah, on the other hand, was a bit more cooperative during the investigation, and she did admit to sending out texts from B's phone pretending to be her. But obviously that plan failed pretty quickly because the texts didn't sound like B at all. They lacked her personality, and also the U-turn that B made about lying about Scott taking advantage of her was so bizarre. Anyone who read it knew that the texts weren't from B. Top this with the 3-day wait before officially reporting B missing, and so many holes in their stories just don't add up. Even without being able to prove that Scott took B's life, and without ever finding B's body, the jury finally reached a verdict. In 2021, almost a year after B went missing, the Cambridge Crown Court found Scott Walker guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Another factor that was included in Scott's sentence was his uncooperativeness in disclosing information about B's body. Due to this, the prisoner's disclosure of information about Victims Act of 2020, better known as Helen's Law, was passed in November of 2020, and it was applicable in Scott's case. Helen's Law basically forbids criminals from getting released on bail if they don't disclose information about where they disposed of a victim's body. When Scott's trial and sentencing was over, all that was left was Sarah. She was also tried in court, but there wasn't enough evidence to charge her for B's murder. It was unclear if she had known about Scott's terrible plan before it was carried out, but she was found guilty on the count of perverting the course of justice, similar to Scott, and she was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Sadly, more than 3 years later, Bernadette's body has still not been found, and no one besides Scott knows what happened to her. The police searched and combed through different areas and even employed the use of drones, searching equipment, and canine units. But tragically, nothing came up. The detective on B's case, Detective Justine Jenkins, said, quote, "We may never know the truth about what Scott did and why, but we do know Bernadette had made allegations of abuse against him." B's brother, Anthony, fought till the end to find answers about why his sister's life was taken so suddenly and so barbarically. He's still hopeful that the detectives will be able to locate B so that he can get a proper goodbye. But on December 22nd, 2023, the air around HM Prison in Full Sutton felt strangely cleaner than usual. Turns out that's because there was one less scumbag breathing it, as Scott passed away that day at the age of 53. The only unfortunate thing about his passing is that this officially means there's zero chance of investigators learning where B's remains were hidden. Why Scott didn't disclose information on where B's body was is still unclear. It may be that he still wanted some kind of control over B's grieving siblings, and he wanted to get the last word in. I genuinely have a hard time wrapping my head around just how horrible, how awful, and how gross this disgusting man was. I mean, you already lost. You already got caught. You got charged. You got convicted. Just give it up and tell your family where B is. It's very clear at this point Scott was only withholding the information because he knew how much it would hurt B's siblings. B was a gifted photographer who tried her best to see the good in everyone, even to the person who practically ruined and then ended her life. She still respected him as a father. This is one of those cases that just sucks. I just wish there was something we could do. Sarah is due to be released from prison in 2027, and who knows how this will pan out for the other 9 people she gave birth to. I hope with everything I have that this awful woman was able to turn her life around while behind bars. But I've just got to be honest this time. I don't think there's any coming back from the awful person that she was and probably still is. Redemption is always possible, but let's be clear that sometimes... Guys, I don't know if you've ever been the victim of this type of abuse or if you're currently trapped in this type of situation, but do not reach out to family. Do not reach out to friends. Reach out to the police. You can find help. There are people who will believe you, and it's always best if you can provide some tiny shred of evidence to help the police as well. But even if you can't, reach out. It is never too soon, but B is such a terrible example that it can always be too late. Do not let this happen to you. And if you know of someone who's in a similar situation, don't dare let this continue. Step up. At the end of it all, I just hope that B's siblings are okay. And I hope they're able to move on from this because at the end of the day, sometimes that's all we can do is just try to move on. Thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of True Crime Stories. I wanted to give a special thank you to a couple channel members, including Candy Crooker and Daniel Silva. If you also want to become a member of the channel, you'll gain access to new videos sometimes days or weeks before they're uploaded to the public, and it's currently the best way you can support the channel and help out, and I really appreciate all of you that have decided to do that. If you want to join, you can click that big join button below the video or find the link down in the description. But as always, if you enjoyed this video, check out this other interesting case I covered, and don't forget to subscribe. It's totally free and keeps you up to date with all of my future videos. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.